In this video, we'll cover the basics of designing a harness in RapidHarness. So let's get started. To begin, I'll click the New Design button, and in this screen, you can see all the different designs that RapidHarness supports. You can always create any of these designs on your own, but RapidHarness comes with a database of parts, so you don't have to start from scratch. And we'll check out this database and see all those parts a bit later, but for now, let's go ahead and click to create a new harness. As I press this button, we can see we now have a new tab representing this harness. So let's check out a couple areas of the screen here. In the left section we have our harness assembly. This is where we can edit the part number and description of our harness, and both these properties will be used when we're searching for our designs. We can also see all the parts that are used within our harness, things like cables, connectors, splices, and wires, and we'll see more on the assembly as we build out our harness. In the next tab, we can manage the connections in our harness. Right now our harness is brand new, but below is where we would list all the connections that we could edit and search. And the last tab is the design rule checker, and this is where we can check our design for any potential mistakes or issues before we send it off to production. And we'll see this at the end of the video. And then on the right half of the screen we have two tabs. We have the top level view, which shows us the overall picture of the harness. This will contain things like our connectors, splices, and all the bundles connecting them together. And the last tab is the wiring table. This document is used for manufacturing and building our harness. It will show us all the connections in our harness in a production-ready document. And what's great about this document is that the wiring table is automatically generated and maintained for us by RapidHarness. The wiring table comes with a default template here, and this template helps define things like the page size, so this one's 11 by 8.5, as well as puts these fields up at the top, like title, part number, and description. The top level also has a template here, and if we wanted to change things like these fields at the bottom or change our own logo, you can easily change the template in the design assembly on the left. And for more on that, you can check out the video on designing templates. But for now, let's go ahead and fill out our harness part number and description, and I'll just put in a couple examples I have in mind here. And for the description, I'll just put demo harness. And at this point, let's go ahead and add a couple of connectors to our harness and show how to add some connections between them. To do this, I'll click the Insert menu in the ribbon, and for now I want to add connectors, so I'll go ahead and click the Connector button. Here's where we have a list of all our connectors, and this is where we can see and search for all the connectors in the RapidHarness database, as well as any connectors that anyone in your company has created. In this list, we can see each part's part number, description, as well as information on when it was last saved. And I have a couple of connectors in mind, so I'm going to search for a mil standard size 11 connector. And in the results below, I'm going to select the 1135 connector right here. And I'll actually change the quantity to 2 as well, so we'll add 2 connectors at once. And now I can just hit the Add Connector button, or I can also just double-click anywhere in this row here to add it. So now that we've added these connectors, we can see a couple of things have changed. First of all, in the top level, we can see that there are 2 connectors that have been added, and they've been automatically named connectors C1 and C2. And next to their name here is a number 1, and this number 1 corresponds to the leader table here on the right, which says item 1 is a connector, and here's the part number that we just picked. In addition to the top level, we can also see these 2 connectors were added to the connectors folder in our harness assembly. In here we can see their names followed by their part number to the right. And if we want to see what the design looks like, I can always select anything in the design assembly, right-click on it, and click View Design. So if I do this, we can see this opens a new tab, and here we can see its properties, including its part number and description, as well as the set of cavities in this connector. And we can see this design has 13 cavities named 1 through 13. But let's go ahead and close this for a moment and go back to our harness. I can also show at this point, if I expand one of these connectors, we can see a list of contacts that are coming from the design of the connector we were just looking at. So here's 1 through 13 from connector C1. And if I want to specify a specific part number for each of these contacts, I can select a contact, right-click on it, and select Specify Design. But I can also do it by clicking on the entire contacts folder, right-clicking, and then choosing Specify All Contact Designs. So let's do that real quickly. So when this opens, let's just go ahead and search for a 22 to 20 gauge pin. And let's pick the one here let's pick the crimp one. And when we set this here, we can see all the contacts in our contacts folder have that part number. And connector C1 has a second reference to the leader table, which is pointing to item 2, and that's our contact part number right there that we just added. And the same way we just changed contacts, if I wanted to change one of the connector designs, I can right-click on the connector and choose to change its design. And let's go ahead and actually try this on connector C2, and then let's search for a 1335 connector. There it is. And if we change this and we go over and expand connector C2 and look at the contacts folder, we can see there's a different set of contacts than those that were in connector C1. And in addition, if we look at the top level, we can see connector C2 has a reference to item number 2 now, which corresponds to our 1335 connector there. Let me collapse this. And if we wanted to rename one of these connectors, I can right-click and go down to the bottom and choose Rename. And here I can change C2, let's change it to P1. And now we can see the name also changed here in the top level to connector P1. And the last thing to show here with connectors is if I right-click on these, I can also add various parts to them. So in this case, I can add backshells, boots, custom parts, heat shrinks, and locks. So let's go ahead and show a couple examples of these. And I'll start by adding a backshell here. And let's add a straight backshell. And when we add this, we can see we have a backshell listed here with our part number. And now item number 1 points to the backshell. Let's go ahead and add a couple more here. So in C1, let's also add a boot. And I'll just choose this generic boot. And then let's add a couple to connector P1 as well. So let's right-click, and here let's add a heat shrink. This one. And then let's also add a lock. And there's our lock there. And the last one to show here is the custom part. So custom parts are used if you want to add a unique part. So for example, when we right-click on this and select to add a custom part, here I get to add things like its design type, part number, and other properties here. So let's just add an example one here, and let's pretend I wanted to add a plastic cap here. So I'll call the type plastic cap. And the part number, I'll pretend I have a part number here. And let's put we'll leave manufacturer blank and put quantity to 1. And for details, I'll type plastic protective cap. And now when I press the Add Custom Part button, we can see it was added to our connector P1, and as well it's showing up in our leader table. Let me move this over a little bit. So now we can see there's that plastic cap we just added, and that's item number 8 here on P1. So at this point, we're ready to add some connections to our harness. And I should mention real quickly that all of the things that we were doing to our connectors don't have to be done in that order. We can always add them at a later point. And I typically don't end up filling out these properties until my harness is much closer to being finalized. We just were looking at the design assembly, so I wanted to show some of the basics before we continued further. So at this point, let's go ahead and add a couple of connections to our harness. And to do this, I'll go click the Connections tab on the left here. And again, we're just starting our harness, so right now it doesn't have any connections yet, but they'll show up down here. To add a connection, I'll click the Create New Connection button here at the top, and we can see when I press this, this section expands down here, and we have to fill out a couple of different properties. So to create a connection, we have to specify the from and to destinations, and both of these are required, which you can see by this little asterisk right here. And optionally, you can specify a conductor or any connection notes as well. And if you ever forget how to get started or what is required, you can always just hit the Add Connection button here. And when you do this, you'll see all the errors associated with the current connection in red at the bottom. And in this case, we still need to specify the from endpoint of our connection. So the first connection here that I want to create is just adding a connection between C1 and P1. So in the from field here, I'll choose connector C1. And when I do this, we can see we now have to also specify a from cavity. And if I expand this list here, we can see all 13 of the cavities that we were looking at earlier, as well as some special cases up at the top. So the first special case is NC, or no connect, and this one's typically used if you have a cable with extra wires that you don't plan to use. So a connection to NC just indicates that the connection should be terminated near the connector, but it's not electrically connected to anything. And the second option here is a housing, and this is used for terminating a connection to either the housing of a connector or to a backshell, and this is most commonly used for terminating a drain wire connection. And the last option here is custom cavity, and if I select this one, you can see that I'm given the option to manually type a cavity name, but custom cavities are most commonly used if you have a connector without a design or you're in the middle of changing your connector designs. So this allows you to work without affecting any of your other connections. For now though, let's just choose contact 1 here to keep this simple. And then in the to field, let's choose connector P1. And here we can see we have a different set of cavities for connector P1, but let's choose contact 1 here as well. And at this point, I could also specify a wire or cable in the conductor section here, or add any notes below, but both of these fields are optional. And we've designed RapidHarness to let you design your schematics without these properties. Of course, you could always add them right now, or we can go back and add them later. But for many designs, you either don't know them until a much later point in the design, or you don't need them at all. So this flexibility allows you to design your harnesses really quickly and doesn't enforce any constraints on your design process. So for the moment, let's just go ahead and click the Add Connection button here. So when I press this, we can see now we have one of one connections here, and our connection was added to the list below. And we can also see that a bundle was added connecting connector C1 to connector P1 in the top level drawing. And this bundle shows us in the top level that there's at least one connection connecting these two connectors together. And if we continue to add more connections between these two connectors, this top level bundle will stay the same. If we want to see the connections individually, I can select the connection in the list, and the furthest left column here is for highlighting. So if I check this box here, I can turn on the highlighting, and now we can see contact 1 on connector C1 connects to contact 1 on connector P1. We can also see some changes if we look at the wiring table document, and this table shows us a list of all of the connections in our harness in a production-ready document, and here's where we can see that RapidHarness is automatically drawing and updating this for us. And one thing to note here is the wiring table is showing us two connections. It's showing us both the forward and the reverse connection. So here we can see connector C1.1 is connected to connector P1.1, but then we also see the reverse of it where P1.1 is connected to C1.1. And you can change if you want to see this or not. That's an option in the wiring table template, which you can see in the designing templates video. But typically we use this view with the reverse connections, so when you're building your harness, you can more quickly look up connections and also know when it's okay to close out a connector. And this will be a little bit clearer when we look at some more connections. So let's go back to the top level and add a couple more connections. And I'm going to add some connections between contacts 2, 3, and 4 in the same manner. So let's go ahead and add connector C1 contact 2 to connector P1 contact 2. And we'll hit add, and let's do 3 to 3, hit add, and then we can connect 4 to, let's do contact 9 in this case. And we'll hit add. And now that we've added these, we can go to our list in the bottom here and we can check them off to highlight them all. We can see all of them showing up here in our top level. And also if I click and select with the shift key, I can right click and unhighlight like that. Or I could hit the space bar. And we can also look at the wiring table here, and here's where we can begin to see by showing the reverse connections how you can easily look up every connection on connector C1 for instance. So back at the top level here, let's turn these back on. So I'll select them and then I'll just hit the space bar here to highlight them. And before we add more connections, let's go ahead and actually edit the last connection that we just created. So if I select this connection here at the bottom and right click on it, I can choose to edit the connection here, or I could just double click on the row. And when I do this, we can see at the top it now says edit connection C1.4 P1.9, and I can just go ahead and change any of these fields here. So for instance, if I change contact 9, let me change it to contact 4, And when we hit Save Changes here, we can see our row is updated at the bottom here to P1.4. Our top level drawing has been fixed. And as well, if we look at the wiring table, we can see all this has been automatically updated for us. Later on, we'll show how to add wires and cables, but first I want to add a few more connections to make this harness a bit more interesting. So what I'm going to do is add another connector. So I'll go up to the Insert menu here and click Connector again. And in here, I'm going to search for a DT series connector. So I'll do a DT03, 4, and I'll search for a 3-pin one here. And let's take this pin one here, and I'll click Add. And now we can see it's been added to our harness as connector C2 right here, and we can also see it in the Design Assembly in our Connectors folder. But let's go ahead and add a couple connections. So I'm going to click Create New Connection. And here we just want to add a couple connections which we'll eventually use to wire up a cable. So what I'll do is connect connector C1, cavity 5, and let's do connector C2, and let's just do these first 3 connections. So 6 to 2, and then 7 to 3, and click Add. And let me just turn off the highlighting here, and we can see these ones, of course. And the last connection I want to add will be used to connect up my drain wire. So what I'm going to do is select connector C1, and I'll choose the housing. And then for C2, let's choose to do actually let's do the no connect. And then I'll hit Add Connection. And here's where we can see our connection was added. So there's the housing to C2 no connect. And we'll see that later on. So aside from just adding connectors to our harness, we can also add some other endpoints that we can use for other types of connection terminations. And some of these things are ferrules, loose wire ends, some various different terminals here, and some splices. And let's start by looking at this splice here. So I'll click Insert Splice here. And when I press this, I'm actually just going to choose to use an empty design. And this empty design will indicate that I want a splice, but I don't have a specific part number in mind. So when this is added, we can see our splice here in the top level drawing here as S1. And as well, if we look at the top level, even though this doesn't have a design, we can see our splices in the Splices folder here down at the bottom. And I could right click on it and choose to do things like change the design later, rename it, all the other stuff that we looked at. And let's go ahead and make some connections to our splice. So I'm going to connect connector C1, and let's choose cavity 8, and then we'll connect it to S1. And in this case, we can see when we select our splice, they don't have any cavities, so we can just hit the Add Connection button. And here we can see our bundle and our new connection at the bottom here. And let's actually terminate our splice to one last connector. So let's go insert a connector here. And I'm actually going to search for generic here. And we can see when we look at this search, we have some generic designs. And these can be used if you don't have an exact part number in mind, or if you want to go back and pick one later. So for now, I'm just going to pick this 2-cavity connector here and add it to our harness. And then let's go ahead and connect our splice to this new connector. So I'm going to choose connecting from S1, and then let's choose C3, cavity 1, and we'll add that, and then let's do it also to cavity 2 and add that. And we can see them at the bottom here and in our top level. And the one unique thing about splices is when you click to highlight any of them, it shows us the complete path of conductance. So here we can see cavity 8 goes through S1 to cavities 1 and 2 on C3. And that's because RapidHarness is showing us the complete path of conductance. And this highlighting will act the same even if I choose to highlight any of these connections individually. And we can take just a quick peek at our wiring table and see again that there's our splice connections listed in here. Some of the other connections that we can add to our harness are things like our ferrules and these terminals again. So let's go ahead and add a ferrule to start here. So I'll click the ferrule button here. And here I'll just search for a 24 gauge red. And I'll pick this first one here. And we can add this to our harness. And let's also show adding a couple of quick connects. So in here, let's search for an orange male, and let me actually search 22 to 20 as well. Okay, that's the one I wanted here. And we can see that quick connects actually have a gender, male and female. And let's add a female one after this just to show it. And let's do a female one. So here let's search for female blue, and let's do 22 to 20 again. And here in the top level we can see QC2, and let's actually move the leader table over again. You can also add ring terminals and spade terminals in the exact same way. And let's go ahead and connect these three up. So I'm going to connect connector C1, contact 9 to F1, and we'll click add, and then let's do 10 to QC1, add this one, and then 11 to QC2, we'll add this one. The last connection termination to show is the loose wire end, and loose wire ends are used in cases where you want to have a wire just hanging in your harness and not terminated to anything. So when I press the insert loose wire end button, RapidHarness immediately adds a loose wire end called LW1 to our harness. And we'll see that again. I can click it again, and we have loose wire end 2 here now. And even though these loose wire ends don't have a design, they still show up on our design assembly here. And here's our terminals as well. So let's finish up these last few connections. And I'll connect C1 contact 12 to loose wire end 1 and hit add. And then let's do C1, last one, 13 to loose wire end 2. And you'll notice loose wire end 1 is no longer available, and that's because they can only be used once for connection. So loose wire end 1 is no longer an option. So at this point in our design, we have a harness that has 16 logical connections, but we haven't specified any conductors to show how any of these connections are physically wired. And we've designed RapidHarness to work like this, where you can choose to add the details as you go. And in this case, it often makes sense to add your logical connections first, and then go back and add your conductors. And let's say at this point in the design, we knew what conductors we wanted to use in our harness, so we're going to go ahead and add some wires and cables and see how those work. So to add some wires, I'm going to go to the Insert menu and click on Wire. And I'm going to search for UL 1007 20 gauge wire. And I'll choose to add this red one here. And when we add this wire, we can see all of our wires in our harness assembly here. So there's our wire 1. And let me go ahead and add 3 more wires. So I'm going to do that same search here for a... And then let me copy that search as well. I'm going to choose this orange wire here. And then I'll search again and add a green wire. And one last wire, let's add a blue wire. So now if we go back to our Connections tab and double click to edit this first connection, now when we hit the conductor dropdown, we can see all the available wires and cables in our harness. And in this case, we can see all 4 wires that we just added. And I'm going to go ahead and click this wire 1 for a first connection. And now when I hit Save Changes, and if we highlight this connection, we can see in the top level that it's now highlighting in the color of our wire. And let me turn on these other 3 connections as well. And I'll edit this second one here to use wire 2. And here, as we continue to assign our conductors, the list of available conductors will shrink down. So I can no longer use wire 1 since I've already used it for the first connection. But let me go ahead and save this, and we can see that our highlighting was updated here. And then for connection, this third connection, we'll choose wire 3, and I'll hit save. And this last connection, let's use our last wire, wire 4, and hit save. And now if we hit the wiring table here, we can see all the wires added in the conductor column. So here's wire 1 red, and then we have their part number here and the gauge here on the right. And of course it's showing up twice for the reverse connection here. for all of our connections. So back in the top level, the last thing we can do with wires is specify how they're twisted together. So if I were to edit this first connection here, because right now the conductor is to an individual wire, it currently says that it's not twisted with anything. And to change this, I could go ahead and click the Manage Wire Twisting button here to the right. This shows us how all the wires are twisted together in our harness. So to twist two of these together, what I can do is select these first two in the list here, for instance, to check them off, and then I can click the Twist Together button. And when I do this, we can see now we have a twisted group that says wire 1 and wire 2. And if I had made a mistake or I wanted to undo this, I could select this thing and then click Remove Twisting. But let's go ahead and twist these together, and let's also twist wire 3 and wire 4 together. And then we'll go ahead and hit Save Changes. And when we do this, now we can see wire 1 says it's twisted with wire 2. And as well, if we look at the wiring table, the twisted with column here now shows that wire 1 is twisted with wire 2, and wire 2 is twisted with wire 1, and so on and so forth. So that's the basics of adding wires to our harness. Let's go ahead and show what it looks like to add a cable to our harness as well. So if I go to the Insert menu and select to insert a cable, here I'll actually search for a 4-wire, 2-twisted pair, and let me actually search 24 gauge as well. And in this case, I'll pick the shielded cable because we want one with that drain wire. And I'm going to add this, but I'll actually add 2 of these. So I'll click 2 and then Add Cable. And let's go ahead and look at what that cable looks like. So on our assembly here, here's our cables. And I'll right click and choose to view this design here. And here we can see this cable has 4 total wires. They're all 24 gauge, and they're in 2 sets of twisted pairs. And they also have a shield here and a drain wire. And in our harnesses, we can use that drain wire as another conductor for any of our connections. So let me go ahead and close this, and we'll go back to our connections. And I want to use this cable to connect connector C1 to connector C2. So I'm going to edit this connection here. And now when we expand the conductor dropdown, we can see all the different wires available to us. And in this case, cable 1 has 4 wires plus a drain wire. And cable 2 also has those same 4 wires and a drain wire. So let's pick the first wire here, cable 1.black. And then we'll hit Save Changes. And the second one, let's just do these in order. We'll do our brown wire. And then this third one, we'll do to our red wire. Save that. And let me turn the highlighting here. I'll turn it off for these ones. Then I'll highlight these 3. And again, they're highlighting in the right color. And the last connection that I wanted to add to our cable was this one down here, C1 housing to C2 no connect. And here let's choose to use our cable 1 drain wire. And this is where our drain wire shows up. And if we go to our wiring table as well, here we can see our conductors were all updated, including the cable and the colors and their part numbers. The one thing to note is the twisted width column is always blank for cables, and that's because twisting of cables is defined by the cable definition itself. So I'm just going to add a couple more connections to our second cable. So let's use it for those our ferrule here, and then the last 2 quick connects. So we'll choose this first one on the cable 2. And then we'll do our quick connect to the next one in cable 2, this brown one. And the last one here, let's do cable 2 red, and we'll save that one as well. So that's all there is to assigning wires and cables to our connections. The one last thing we can mention with editing connections is the notes field. So if I double click this first connection here, this connection notes field is where I can add any sort of note I want. And these notes will appear in our wiring table, and as well they can be used for searching for connections. So for this first one here, let's just add a sample note here to see maybe high voltage system. And then I'll go ahead and save that. And let me add the same note to the second connection here. And now if we were to look at our wiring table, we can see in the notes column, there's our notes that we typed out. And as well, if we were to search for HV, we can see that filters our connections down. Let me go ahead and clear that search out there. So at this point, the last main thing to do with our harness is just to lay out the top level a little bit. And as you've seen, I've already been kind of clicking and dragging to move these components around. So what I want to do is just sort these connectors to make them a little bit more organized. So what I want to do is move connector C2 here. And let me actually turn off the highlighting here to make this clearer. So I'm just going to click and drag to move C2. And you'll notice when a connector is selected, we can see this little arrow at the top of it. And if I click this arrow, I can flip the direction of the connector to face left or to face right. So let me actually move connector C3 over as well, and I'll flip that one. And another thing you can do is click and drag on the canvas to multi-select with a selection rectangle. So the one trick here is if I drag to the left, the rectangle turns green, which means anything intersecting the box will be selected. So in this case, I'll select F1 and QC2. But if I were instead, let me click off, to drag to the right, I won't capture either one of these because they're not fully encompassed by this rectangle. So let me just go ahead and select these three and move them over to the left. And let me actually take F1 and flip it to the left. And then I'll move QC1 next to F1 here. And then let's flip QC2 and put it next to those. And then we'll move our loose wire ends up to the top over here. And move C1 down. And let me just move these a little bit more to the right. And then I'm just going to line up this C3, these three connectors here just to be a little bit cleaner. And then maybe we can move these over just a little bit more again. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Let me actually move C1 over. So the next thing I need to do is arrange my bundles to model their physical layout. So if I click on one of these bundles here, I can right click on it, and I have a couple different options here. The first one here is for adding a layout point, and these are used if you just want to arrange things around the screen. If instead I wanted to have two things come together or split apart, then what I could do is add a branch point here. And we can also specify the lengths of our bundle as well. And this last option here is used for merging two bundles together, and this is if you have more than one bundle selected at a time. So what I'll do is right click on this first one and select Add Branch Point, and then I'll do the same thing to the second one here. And now you can see I have these circles here which I can drag around, and if I drop them on top of each other, then these two branch points become one, and these bundles are merged together here. And the shortcut for this is if I select more than one bundle at a time, I can right click and choose Merge Bundles, and here we can see that automatically created a branch point and merged those two bundles together. So let me go ahead and add a couple more branch points around our harness. So I'll add one up here by our loose wire ends, and then I'll add one down here for these three. And let me actually move it over to the other side. And let me actually move these three over just a bit. And then I can add one last one here for these first three bundles here. So I'll right click and merge those three. So here we go, and let me actually move this over just a bit more. And the last thing to see about branch points is if I click and drag them, we already saw if they can be dragged together. Let me move this out of the way. Then we can see they will sort of snap, and when I let go, they'll join. But if instead I had chosen some branch points that they couldn't be merged to, they'll turn red like this one here. And to see this one, I can turn on this first connection here. And in this case, when trying to merge these two branch points, wire 1 would be folded back on top of itself, which isn't allowed. So fortunately, RapidHarness does that logic for you automatically, and it will prevent you from creating any loops or mistakes in your design. So let's take a quick peek at adding layout points. So I'll right click and add a layout point over here, and here you can see it's a little square, and I'll move it down here. The one thing to note about layout points is I can't merge them with branch points or any other layout points for that matter. They're just used for routing things around the screen. And we can also see if I select a bundle that has a layout point within it, the bundle actually wraps all the way around all the corners of the layout points, as opposed to a branch point here actually creates different distinct bundles. So let me go ahead and add one more layout point here, and I'll move this over, and let me actually move the splice over near our connector over there. So that looks pretty good. The last thing we can do with bundles is edit their lengths. So if I select this first one here and I right click and choose to edit the length, I'll make this first section here 3 feet. And then I can do the same thing on the second one here. I'll make this one 7 feet. And these last two, let's make this one 1 foot. And this one will make 1 foot as well. Okay. So when we specify these lengths, if we look at the wiring table, we can see now the length column is filled out. So from C1 to P1, we can see the length here is 12 total feet. But between C1 and C2, we can see the length here is indicated as greater than or equal to 11 feet. And the reason for this is that if we look at the connection between C1 and C2, we can see these sections here are specified, but this last section isn't specified. So if we right click on this and we actually add a length to it, we'll change this one to 2 feet. And now if we look back at our wiring table, we can see the total length is 13 feet as expected. So RapidHarness is doing that math for us to compute all the total lengths of each connection, and it will do its best to give it a best guess in the cases where things aren't fully specified. And the other place where these lengths will show up will be in our bill of materials and as well in our wire and cable cut list, which we'll look at shortly. And at this point, the last thing I could do with my drawing here is to add some images and text. And I can either do that from the drawing menu here or back in the home menu. I like to do it here because I can adjust the font as well. So when I click insert text here, we can see we get this generic note, and I can click and drag this thing to move it around. And let me actually put it near the bottom here, and I'll resize it to make it the same width here. And then I'll actually use the arrow keys here to move it down. And this can be where you can put any additional notes, whether it's build instructions or some history of changes or whatever else you'd like to add to your drawing. So for the example here, let me just copy paste in some notes I have from Notepad. And the last thing to mention here is that when a text is selected, we can change all the font properties up at the top in the font menu here. So for instance, I could make the font bigger or smaller, and then I could put it to align to the top and then to the left here. And I can also change anything like the color and lines as well. So that looks fine. I'm going to add one more text here near our loose wire ends. And here I'm just going to type terminated in final assembly. And here I'll actually change the background to yellow to make this stand out a little bit more. And the last thing I want to do is add a couple images. So I'll click image here, and then I have this folder of images on my computer. And for this first one, I'm going to choose to use an 1135 graphic I have for our first connector C1. And it looks like I need a little bit more space here, so I'm going to actually go over to the assembly and I'll change our drawing template here. Let me actually just search for the legal one here. Landscape. Okay, and now we can see, let me fit this. And now we can see a little bit more space here. So let me just move this stuff over, move over this note in our leader table. And now I can put our image here over to the left. And let me add a couple more images. I'll choose the 1335 for P1. And then the last image I want to add is for our DT connector here. It was a DT3. So I'll add this one right here. And move this one just a bit over. And this looks pretty good. Let me just turn on some of these connections here. And the last thing I could do here is fill in some of these text fields at the bottom here. So let me just actually copy our part number here, and I'll paste it in here. And then let me type a 1 in our revision, and I'm going to paste it in the wiring table as well. And I'll copy the description, And let's pretend our title was the same as our description. Paste that in here. And then I could also fill in things like my name here, give it today's date. And that sort of shows the basics of filling in those templates. And the last thing to show here is the design rule checker. So if I click on this tab here, we can see all the different violations in our harness. So in this case, we have one here that says connector has unused cavities, one that has unspecified contacts. We have another one here that says the wire gauge doesn't fit into the contactor terminal. So in this case, our cable doesn't fit into either the contactor terminal that it's in. But assuming that I had accepted or fixed these errors, then I could go ahead and print my design and generate the various outputs. So with the top level selected, and I hit the print button, I can see this prints our top level view. And if I were to hit back here and click wiring table, and now I print this one, this is how I can print my wiring table documents. And the last type of output to show here is generating the bill of materials and cut list. So to generate these, I can go to the tools menu here and click to generate BOM. And this is going to create an Excel file here, and I'll just accept this name here and hit save. This will open up Excel, and now we can see the complete bill of materials to create this harness. And let me expand this out here a little bit. And in this list, we can also see the custom part that we added at the beginning of our design. The last one here is to generate the cut list. And again, I'll just accept this name here. And this creates another Excel file. And this one actually has all the individual wires with their individual cuts. So this is useful if you have a step in your operation dedicating to kitting your part list, or if you have a machine that will automatically cut sections of wires and cables for you. So at this point, I can go back to my harness here, and we could click to create a version of this harness to share it with the rest of our team. But for more on that topic, you can check out the video on working with teams and using version control.